EVO. Welcome back to The Devil Within. I'm your host, Brandon Morgan. In last episode, we followed Thomas Creech from a childhood soaked in cold neglect to a drifting adulthood stained in blood. A man who learned early that if you whispered the right kind of darkness, the world would lean in to listen. We ended with Creech sitting in an interrogation room in Ada County, spinning a narrative thick with satanic symbols, shadowy brotherhoods, and voices he claimed whispered orders from the other side. A killer with a growing mythology, a public terrified by the idea of evil hitchhiking its way through the American West, and a justice system trying desperately to separate fact from a monster manipulator's fantasies. Now we pick up the story where the walls close in, literally. Because it's one thing to be a satanic killer on the American highways. It's another to be one behind bars. This is Chapter 4, The Devil Behind the Walls. So prison is supposed to strip a man of his power. Iron bars, locked doors, rituals reduced to paperwork and head counts, and the sound of metal on metal closing behind you. For most inmates, the myth dies at the gates. Not Creech. When he entered the Idaho State Penitentiary in the mid-1970s, Creech walked in not as a criminal, but as a self-styled acolyte of darkness. A man who had convinced himself that confinement would not shrink him, but concentrate him. Guards sensed it immediately. They described him as quiet, controlled, and watchful. The same traits he'd carried since childhood, but sharpened now into a kind of predatory stillness. He wasn't loud. He wasn't defiant. He didn't posture. He simply observed and waited. In one early incident report, a correctional officer wrote, "Inmate Creech displays unusual composure, no visible emotion, answers questions as if performing a ceremony." He performed everything that way: meals, showers, roll call, as if each mundane action had been scripted by something ancient and unseen. Within weeks, he'd gained a reputation among inmates as someone not to be messed with. Not because he picked fights, he didn't, but because of the way he looked at people. One inmate later recalled in a 1987 interview that he had eyes like a preacher and a predator all at the same time. And then there were the drawings. Creech produced them during free hours. Charcoal sketches on scraps of paper or torn book pages. Knives, horned figures, circles intersected by lines with no clear meaning. Symbols that looked, to the untrained eye, like occult diagrams. Now, were they genuine? Were they more of his theatrics? Even prison psychologists couldn't really decide. And still the whispers grew. A few inmates claimed Creech spoke about a brotherhood still operating on the outside. Others said he prayed backwards, muttering phrases that sounded like scripture played in reverse. A corrections officer reported finding a crude altar under Creech's bunk, though the official write-up softened the language to arranged personal items. Prison rumors spread easy, and Creech knew exactly how to feed them. But then came the violence. Creech was linked to multiple inmate altercations, though rarely in ways that could be pinned directly on him. He never bragged, he never gloated. But when questioned about one stabbing, Creech reportedly said, "Sometimes the shadows need blood." Another time, he offered a guard a calm, almost polite warning. You shouldn't search my cell today. The air's wrong." Was any of this real? Or was he just expanding the mythology that had already taken root in the newspapers and the churches on the outside? We know this. By 1976, Creech had confessed to more murders than detectives could log. He hinted at sacrificial rituals in abandoned barns. He claimed he'd anointed one victim with blood symbols. He spoke of a desert ceremony during his wandering years. Not a single one of these stories contained verifiable details, but every time the gossip surfaced among inmates or clergy, Creech's myth metastasized. Even the press couldn't resist. A 1978 syndicated article described him as a self-professed high priest of interstate satanic rites. The story leaned heavily on Creech's own confessions, ignoring the fact that investigators had debunked almost every ritualistic claim. But this was the late 70s. It was the dawn of the Satanic Panic, and America didn't want nuance. It wanted demons walking the highways. Inside prison, Creech thrived on the attention. Outside, he became a symbol, and neither version was fully real. But then came the moment that would change everything. The killing of David Dale Jensen, a disabled inmate Creech bludgeoned to death in 1981. A sickening, brutal murder committed inside the prison walls. A killing that had nothing to do with Satan. No symbols, no rituals, no occult theatrics, just pure violence. But the public didn't care about details. They didn't want a pragmatic explanation. They wanted the monster that they'd been promised. And the media, eager for a headline, obliged. Satanic killer strikes again, this time in prison. Idaho Statesman, editorial section, 1981. Religious groups seized it. Church newsletters circulated warnings about demonic influence infecting the state penitentiary. Pamphlets claimed Creech had summoned dark forces behind bars. None of it was true, but in a courtroom where the truth is supposed to matter, mythology sometimes leaks in through the cracks. Creech was convicted of the Jensen killing, and this time the judge handed down the sentence that followed him into the present day. Death. Not for Satanism, not for ritual murder, but for a senseless killing inside a system already struggling to contain the violence that Creech carried with him like a second skin. And yet, the legend persisted for decades. Chapter 5. The Demon on Death Row. Prisons have their own weather. You can feel it when you walk down a tier, the thick, humid pressure of human misery sealed behind layers of steel and concrete. Some men survive it, but some men break under it. And some men, like Thomas Creech, seem to thrive because of it. By the early 1980s, after the murder of inmate David Jensen, Creech was no longer just another violent prisoner. He was now the violent prisoner, the state's most controversial inmate, the man whose name escaped the walls of the penitentiary and seeped into church sermons, into talk radio broadcasts, and late-night news specials. A killer who had created his own mythology so successfully that even religious leaders who should have known better repeated it. Death row brought structure to his life, but not the kind designed to rehabilitate. Creech lived inside a concrete box where the lights buzzed constantly and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old metal. Meals arrived through a small rectangular slot. Recreation consisted of pacing a fenced yard no larger than a child's bedroom. Time was measured not by clocks, but by the slow decay of hope. And yet Creech began to take on a strange, unsettling calm. Guards described him as disciplined. Psychiatrists described him as emotionally blunted. But other inmates described him as something else entirely. He had a presence, one former death row prisoner would later claim, like he knew things that he shouldn't know. Rumors spread. They always do in places where truth is hard to come by and fear is cheap. Some men said Creech prayed to Satan in the dark. Others said he had prophetic dreams about death row executions. One inmate swore Creech had predicted Jensen's death before it happened. A claim impossible to verify, but just intoxicating enough to become part of the death row folklore. And Creech, never one to pass up an opportunity to add fuel to the myth, occasionally played along. During a psychological evaluation in the mid-'80s, he told this to a state psychiatrist. "There's more going on here than you people understand. There's work to be done. Death row is only a place if you believe in walls. It was nonsense, but it somehow sounded like prophecy. What made Creech dangerous wasn't Satanism. It wasn't even really his violence. It was his instinct for manipulating fear. He understood the theatrical power of implying that his murders were part of something larger, something darker and ritualistic. And during the height of the Satanic Panic, Americans were primed to believe it. Church newsletters throughout Idaho began printing warnings about Creech, often written in breathless tones. "A demon walks among us, a satanic killer in the state penitentiary." Local pastors preached about him by name, calling him proof of demonic influence in American prisons. One group claimed that Creech had formed a satanic circle inside death row, a claim the Idaho Department of Corrections dismissed publicly as fantasy, but privately joked about in the staff lounge because they'd seen the letters flooding in from terrified parishioners. All the while, Creech just sat quietly in his cell. Sometimes he smirked when guards handed him religious pamphlets. Sometimes he tore them up. Sometimes he tucked them neatly under his mattress like a forbidden keepsake. And then there were the interviews. Creech gave several during the 80s, each with a different tone depending on the outlet. In one, he denied Satanism entirely, calling it a convenient lie people tell themselves. In another, he alluded to a dark path that he'd chosen willingly. In a third, he said, "People need devils. I just became one at the right time." And that's the line that appeared in newspapers across the Northwest, not because it was true, but because it was perfect. Even law enforcement struggled with these contradictions. During a taped conversation with an investigator reviewing his case, Creech said, "These killings weren't random. They were offerings." Now, when pressed for details, he backtracked and claimed that he'd been misinterpreted, but then shifted again and hinted at ritual significance. The detective later said, "I don't think Creech believed half the things he said, but he enjoyed watching us wonder which half was real." So the Jensen murder, the one that sentenced him to death, became the anchor around which religious groups rallied. Pastor-led anti-Satanism brigades used Creech as a cautionary tale, a symbol of spiritual decay. Cable talk shows brought on occult experts who linked Creech to non-existent satanic networks. Meanwhile, every official report, every court record, every forensic detail pointed to the same conclusion. Creech killed Jensen because he wanted to, not because the devil told him to, not because of a ritual, not because of a cult. But the truth was too small, too insignificant. The myth was far more satisfying. And Creech never corrected the public. I mean, why would he? For the first time in his life, he had a kind of power. Behind bars, his legend grew while his physical world shrank. Days split into weeks, weeks into years. Appeals were filed, denied, appealed again. Journalists occasionally requested follow-up interviews, and Creech played the same game he always had, offering fragments, hints, glimpses of a darkness he never fully defined. And then, in the late 1990s, something odd happened. Creech softened. He began reading philosophy. He requested materials on Buddhism. He wrote letters to victims' families, half apology, half justification, all unsettling in their emotional flatness. Some guards speculated he was preparing for his execution. Others thought he'd simply gotten tired of the persona he'd been performing for decades. But if you ask anyone who worked death row during those years, they'll tell you. Creech never lost the quiet, predatory aura that made him infamous. Not for a day. Not even now. Chapter 6. The Monster That Wouldn't Die. For most men on death row, time is a narrowing hallway. Each appeal, a door closing. Each year, another bulb flickering out one by one until the corridor ends at a steel table with restraints and a needle. But Thomas Eugene Creech had always rewritten the script, not by virtue, not by innocence, simply by endurance. And something far stranger. He is, as of this recording, one of the longest-held death row inmates in the United States. Nearly half a century behind bars, 4 decades of appeals, countless legal twists, stays, reversals, resentencings, reinstatements, like a ghost that refuses to leave the house that it haunts. And maybe that's the strangest thing about him. He's still here. Today, Creech is housed at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, a place so barren and controlled that even the idea of a legend surviving inside it feels absurd. His world has shrunk to a concrete rectangle. Solid bed, hard floor, small desk, a polished steel mirror that reflects a man who once terrified entire states. The mythology, however, refuses to shrink with him. Religious groups still occasionally write pamphlets warning that Creech represents the devil's presence in our modern age. Paranormal bloggers recycle decades-old Satanic Panic narratives and represent them as fact. Reddit threads regurgitate his debunked brotherhood claims as if they uncovered new evidence. And it all feeds a myth that has long outpaced the man. But Creech plays his part with strange discipline. In recent interviews, he's spoken about spirituality. Not Satanism now, but Buddhism, forgiveness, the meaning of suffering. And yet, if you read between the lines, something familiar remains. A hunger, a flicker, the old satisfaction that comes from watching people look at him and wonder, is there still something dark in there? During a 2019 clemency hearing, a psychiatrist described Creech as a man who has learned to speak the language of remorse without necessarily feeling it. A state attorney put it far more bluntly. He is manipulative, intelligent, and capable of reinventing himself when it serves his interests. Even now, after 40-plus years, Creech still carries an aura that unsettles correctional staff. Some mention the way he watches. Others mention the way he smiles. One described him as a calm ocean that you know has shipwrecks beneath it. But to understand Creech today, you have to step back from the myth and look at the structural truth. The satanic elements were always his most effective tool, not because they guided his violence, but because they shaped his identity. It started in that interrogation room with claims about the circle. It grew in the press when reporters latched onto words like ritual. It metastasized during the Satanic Panic when pastors needed an example. And Creech, who spent his childhood invisible, his youth drifting, his crimes committed in the margins, he suddenly found himself at the center of something huge, something powerful, something that made people tremble. Darkness became Creech's currency. Later, it became his leash. And today, it's the only story most people know about him. In the late 90s and early 2000s, death penalty attorneys worked extensively to challenge the procedural elements of Creech's sentencing. Some of the appeals focused on the psychological evaluations. Others focused on the question of intent in the Jensen murder. But no one succeeded in freeing him. But they did complicate the path to his execution. Then, in 2023, Idaho resumed aggressive efforts to schedule Creech's lethal injection. He came within weeks of a final date. But legal challenges continued. Witnesses came forward. Old records needed review. And once again, Creech slipped by. Not through innocence, not through cunning, but through the grinding chaos of the American death penalty system. One more door stayed open. One more year passed. He remains on death row. Not mythical, not supernatural. Just a man who's lived long enough for his legend to calcify around him like armor. And if you walk through the halls where he's confined today, the concrete, the fluorescent glare, the echoing metal, it is both unsettling and strangely anticlimactic how ordinary it all feels, how mundane, how small the space is compared to the size of the monster the world built out of him. But then you remember, a prison cell is incapable of containing a myth. Only a body can do that. And Creech's body, stubbornly, relentlessly, is still alive. He's watched wardens retire. He's watched officers age. He's watched believers in his brotherhood die off. He's watched the Satanic Panic rise, climax, collapse, and now, disturbingly, return in the digital age. He outlasted all of it. Not because the devil protected him, not because of rituals or circles or shadows, but because sometimes life, real life, is stranger than the stories we tell about it. And so, here he remains, an old man on death row, a relic of a violent past, and a myth that refuses to loosen its grip on the American imagination. And that's where our story ends, with Thomas Creech alive on death row, still suspended in the strange twilight between man and monster, between fact and legend. He's a reminder of the way evil can be exaggerated, manipulated, weaponized, and how sometimes the scariest thing isn't the myth we build around a killer, but the truth that survives long after the headlines fade. Next week on The Devil Within, we travel somewhere colder, stranger, deeper. A story about a disappearance that should have been impossible, a crime scene that rewrote itself, and a killer who may have walked straight out of folklore. You'll want to keep the lights on for this one. If you're drawn into these stories, or if they're starting to draw into you, make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a rating, a review, comment, or tell a friend who loves the strange and the terrifying. Visit evocreative.com for more and follow us on Instagram at The Devil Within Pod and at Evo Creative. Your support keeps the shadows talking. And please consider supporting the great companies that still support long-form storytelling. Quince, luxury essentials at honest prices. Go to quince.com/devilwithin for free shipping and 365-day returns. Mint Mobile, premium wireless for just $15 a month. Go to mintmobile.com/devilwithin. ExpressVPN, protect your data anywhere. Go to expressvpn.com/devilwithin for up to 4 months free. And Mood, legal THC and CBD shipped nationwide. Visit mood.com/devilwithin for 20% off. Again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week. Until then, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an EVO production recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.